Every war has its turning points, and every turning point has its price. In 1916, that price was paid along a quiet river in northern France, where the earth itself would be torn apart by artillery and the hopes of nations would be measured in yards of mud. The Somme, a name that still echoes through history, carrying with it the weight of a generation's sacrifice. This is the story of the men who fought there, the commanders who sent them forward, and the battle that came to define the terrible cost of modern war. By 1916, Europe had been bleeding for nearly 2 years. The war that many believed would end by Christmas of 1914 had become something no one had foreseen. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, 450 miles of trenches scarred the face of France and Belgium. Millions of men had already fallen, yet the lines on the map had barely moved. The Western Front had become a wound that would not heal. The nature of this new warfare defied everything the old generals had known. Barbed wire stretched in thick belts across no man's land, tangling the feet of any soldier who tried to cross. Machine guns, those terrible instruments of industrial killing, could cut down advancing infantry faster than any weapon in history. And behind the trenches, heavy artillery waited to shatter anything that moved. The defender held every advantage. An army could lose 10,000 men trying to capture a single village, only to lose it again the following week. The war had become a siege without end, a stalemate written in blood. Yet the Allies remained determined. France and Belgium lay under German occupation, their villages burned, their people displaced. Honor demanded liberation. Strategy demanded action. To stand still was to accept defeat, and so the British and French commanders agreed that 1916 would bring a renewed offensive. Together, they would strike a blow powerful enough to break the deadlock and drive the Germans back toward their own borders. But war rarely follows the plans of those who wage it. In February of 1916, the Germans struck first. They launched a massive assault against the French fortress city of Verdun, a place of profound symbolic importance to France. The German strategy was grimly simple. They would bleed the French army white by attacking a position France could not afford to abandon. And it worked. French reserves poured into Verdun by the hundreds of thousands, feeding the furnace of a battle that would rage for 10 months. By spring, the French army was stretched to its breaking point. The summer offensive could no longer be a joint operation of equal partners. The French, consumed by Verdun, could spare only a fraction of the forces originally promised. The burden would fall instead upon British shoulders. What had been planned as a combined blow would become the largest British attack of the war, with a new and desperate purpose. The offensive must relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. It must draw German reserves away from that bleeding wound before France collapsed entirely. General Sir Douglas Haig had taken command of the British Expeditionary Force just months before. A cavalry officer of the old school, he believed in the power of offensive action and the possibility of breakthrough. He would have preferred to attack near Ypres in Belgium, where clearer strategic objectives lay within reach, where a successful advance might threaten German submarine bases along the coast. But strategy bowed to necessity. The Somme was where the British and French armies met along the front, the only place where the diminished French forces could still fight alongside their ally. The Somme it would be. Under Haig served Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson, commander of the Fourth Army, the force that would lead the assault. Rawlinson was a more cautious man than his superior, a believer in limited objectives and methodical advances. Together they drew up the plan, though their visions did not always align. Haig dreamed of breakthrough and cavalry exploitation. Rawlinson thought in terms of capturing trenches and consolidating gains. This tension between ambition and caution would shape the battle to come. Rawlinson would have preferred more time. Many of his divisions were untested, filled with volunteers who had never seen combat. These were the men of the PALS battalions, the eager recruits who had answered the call in 1914 when Kitchener's pointing finger appeared on posters across Britain. They had enlisted together, friends and neighbors and workmates promised they could serve alongside the men they knew. From the mills of Lancashire and the mines of Wales, from the offices of London and the farms of Yorkshire, they had come forward in their thousands. Now, after months of training, they were about to face the reality of modern war. The French needed help immediately. There could be no waiting for perfect readiness. Summer was approaching, and with it the moment when theory would meet reality, when plans drawn on maps would be tested in blood and fire. The attack would come in July, along 25 miles of front near the river Somme. The British would strike north of the river, the French to the south. Together, they would attempt what 2 years of warfare had made to seem impossible. They would try to break the line. The ground the British would attack had not always been a fortress. In the early months of the war, the Somme Valley had been a quiet sector, far from the heaviest fighting that raged around Ypres and Verdun. The lines here had stabilized quickly, and neither side had seen reason to disturb the uneasy peace. But what was quiet for the generals was opportunity for the engineers. While other fronts consumed men and ammunition in endless attacks and counterattacks, the Germans along the Somme had been given the gift of time, and they had used it well. By the summer of 1916, the German defenses facing the British had become something unprecedented in the history of warfare. 2 complete defensive lines stretched across the rolling chalk downland, with a third under construction further back. These were not simple ditches scratched into the earth. They were intricate systems, engineered with the precision and thoroughness for which the German army was renowned. Each defensive line consisted of 3 separate trenches running parallel to one another. The fire trench faced the enemy, where sentries watched and riflemen waited. Behind it lay the support trench, where reserves sheltered, ready to reinforce any threatened point. Further back still ran the reserve trench, the final line of resistance before open country. Communication trenches connected all 3, allowing men and supplies to move forward without exposing themselves to enemy fire. The villages that dotted the landscape had been transformed into strongpoints: Thiepval, Le Boissel, Fricourt, Mametz, Montauban. Names that would soon be written in blood had become anchors for the German line. Cellars were reinforced with concrete, windows blocked and turned into firing slits, gardens strung with wire. Each village became a small fortress unto itself, capable of independent defense even if the trenches on either side should fall. The fortified ruins could pour enfilading fire into any attackers who tried to bypass them, making every advance a deadly gamble. Machine gun positions had been sited with murderous care. The Germans understood, perhaps better than anyone, the terrible mathematics of the machine gun. A single weapon could fire 500 rounds per minute, enough to cut down an entire battalion caught in the open. These guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, so that ground which seemed safe from one position was swept by bullets from another. Concrete emplacements protected the guns and their crews from all but direct hits by heavy artillery. Some positions were hidden in the ruins of buildings, others dug into the forward slope of ridges where they commanded vast killing grounds. In front of all these defenses lay the wire. Belt after belt of barbed wire, some of it thick as a man's arm, stretched across no man's land in tangles designed to slow and channel attacking infantry. The wire was not merely an obstacle, it was a trap. Gaps were left deliberately, funneling attackers into lanes where machine guns had been carefully aimed. A soldier caught on the wire was a soldier who would not live long. The barbs tore at uniforms and flesh while bullets found their marks. Many men would die hanging on these rusting strands, unable to advance or retreat. But the true genius of the German defenses lay beneath the surface, invisible to the British observers who studied the trenches through binoculars and periscopes. The chalk soil of the Somme was easily excavated, and the Germans had dug deep. Their dugouts descended 10 meters or more below the surface, carved into the solid rock where no artillery shell could reach. These were not mere holes in the ground. They were underground barracks, fitted with wooden bunks, electric lighting powered by generators, and ventilation shafts to keep the air breathable. Some contained kitchens and medical stations, Officers enjoyed private quarters with furniture carried down from the ruined villages above. When the bombardment came, as the Germans knew it would, the defenders would simply descend into these subterranean shelters and wait. The earth above might heave and shatter, the trenches might collapse and fill with debris, but the men below would survive. They had food and water for days. They had ammunition stacked in ready piles. They had machine guns oiled and prepared, waiting to be carried up the stairs the moment the shelling stopped. The dugouts transformed the German line from a defensive position into an ambush waiting to be sprung. Communication was equally well prepared. Telephone lines connected the front trenches to artillery batteries positioned miles behind the line. But these were not ordinary field telephones strung on poles, where any shell burst might sever them. The cables had been buried 6 feet deep, below the reach of all but the heaviest explosions. When British infantry emerged from their trenches, German observers could telephone coordinates to their gunners within seconds. Shells would begin falling on the attackers before they had crossed half of no man's land. The buried lines meant that even under the heaviest bombardment, the German defenders could call down fire support with terrible precision. The men who held these positions were not the raw recruits that filled many British battalions. The German troops along the Somme were veterans, hardened by nearly 2 years of combat. Many had fought at Ypres or in the east against the Russians. They knew the sound of incoming shells and had learned when to take cover and when to stand firm. They trusted their defenses and trusted each other. The camaraderie of shared danger had forged them into cohesive units that would not easily break. They also knew the attack was coming. The British buildup had been impossible to hide. For weeks, German observers had watched the roads behind the British lines clogged with artillery pieces, ammunition wagons, and marching columns of infantry. New railway spurs had been constructed to bring up supplies. Headquarters had been established in villages miles behind the front. Aeroplanes flew constant patrols over the German trenches, photographing every position. To the defenders watching from their parapets, the signs were unmistakable. The only questions were precisely when and precisely where. German intelligence provided the answers. Prisoners captured in trench raids revealed details of the coming assault. British telephone communications, sent in codes that German listeners had broken, confirmed the date and objectives. By the eve of battle, the German command knew almost as much about British plans as British commanders themselves. There would be no surprise. The defenders would be waiting, rifles cleaned, machine guns loaded, artillery ranged on the ground the British must cross. The element of shock, that precious advantage which might have compensated for the strength of the defenses, had been surrendered before the first shell was fired. And so the Germans waited in their deep shelters and fortified villages, confident in their preparations, watching the calendar count down toward the end of June. Above them, the chalk downs lay quiet beneath the summer sun, the barbed wire rusting in the morning dew, the machine guns silent in their concrete nests. The trap was set. All that remained was for the British to walk into it. The British answer to the fortress before them was artillery. More artillery than had ever been assembled in one place. More shells than any army had ever fired. The plan was straightforward in concept, devastating in intended effect. For 7 days and nights before the infantry attack, 1,400 guns would pour destruction upon the German lines. By the time the bombardment lifted, there would be nothing left to resist. The wire would be cut. The trenches would be flattened. The defenders would be dead or driven mad by the endless concussion. The infantry would advance across no man's land and occupy the ruins of what had once been an impregnable position. It was a vision of industrial warfare applied with industrial logic. Enough shells would solve any problem. Enough high explosive would break any defense. The generals had done their calculations and found the numbers reassuring. More than 1,500 guns of all calibers lined the British front, from light field pieces that could fire a dozen rounds per minute to massive howitzers that hurled shells weighing nearly a ton. Ammunition dumps stretched for miles behind the lines, mountains of brass and steel waiting to be fed into hungry breaches. The logistics alone were staggering. a triumph of organization that moved millions of shells from factories in Britain to gun positions in France. The bombardment began on the 24th of June, and for 7 days the guns never stopped. From dawn until dusk, from dusk until dawn, the roar of artillery merged into a single continuous thunder that could be heard across the Channel in England. Observers describe the German lines as disappearing beneath clouds of smoke and dirt, erupting in endless fountains of earth and flame. Surely nothing could survive such destruction. Surely the enemy was being annihilated beneath this avalanche of steel. Yet even as the shells fell, there were men who understood the gap between hope and reality. 19 mines had been dug beneath key German strongpoints, tunnels burrowed through the chalk by specialized mining companies working in silence and darkness. These would be detonated just before the attack began, adding their explosive force to the artillery preparation. The mines, at least, were certain. Tens of thousands of pounds of ammonal packed into underground chambers would obliterate whatever sat above them, but the artillery was another matter entirely. To the north, the British Third Army would conduct a diversionary attack against the village of Gommecourt. This feint was designed to draw German attention and reserves away from the main assault further south. 16 divisions of British and French infantry waited in the trenches, ready to advance the moment the bombardment lifted. They had been told to expect minimal opposition. Many officers informed their men that they could walk across no man's land, that there would be nothing left alive to resist them. Some units were ordered to advance at a steady pace, rifles at the port, maintaining formation as though on parade. Speed was unnecessary when the enemy had already been destroyed. But the enemy had not been destroyed. The reports that filtered back to headquarters during the bombardment told a troubling story, though not everyone chose to hear it. Patrols sent into no man's land under cover of darkness returned with disturbing news. The wire was not cut. In many places, it stood as thick and tangled as before, barely touched by the shell fire that was supposed to have obliterated it. The shells were exploding, certainly, but they were not doing the work expected of them. 1.6 million shells were fired during that week of bombardment, a number that defied comprehension. Yet quantity could not compensate for quality. Many of the gun crews were inexperienced, rushed through training to meet the insatiable demand for artillerymen. Their aim was imprecise, their shells falling long or short of the wire belts they were meant to destroy. The British Army suffered from a critical shortage of heavy guns, the massive howitzers, whose plunging fire could collapse dugouts and demolish strong points. Too many of the available pieces were field guns, designed to fire shrapnel shells that burst in the air and scattered metal balls across a wide area. Shrapnel was deadly against men caught in the open, but nearly useless against barbed wire, which required high explosive to cut. Worse still, a shocking proportion of the shells were duds. Manufacturing had been rushed to meet demand, quality sacrificed for quantity. Perhaps as many as 1/3 of the shells fired during the bombardment failed to explode at all. They buried themselves in the soft chalk and lay there, inert, while the wire above them remained untouched. Other shells exploded prematurely in the gun barrels, killing their own crews. The munitions crisis of 1915 had been addressed with frantic expansion of production, but the shells now reaching the front bore the marks of that haste. The deep dugouts that sheltered German troops proved equally resistant to destruction. The bombardment cratered the surface, collapsed sections of trench, and filled the air with choking smoke and dust. But 10 meters below, the defenders waited in their underground chambers, listening to the muffled thunder above them. The chalk absorbed the shock of explosions. The carefully timbered ceilings held firm. Men played cards, wrote letters, slept fitfully on their wooden bunks. They knew what the bombardment meant. They knew that when it stopped, they would have only seconds to race up the stairs, set up their machine guns, and meet the attack they had been expecting for weeks. Those waiting in the British trenches could not see what their artillery was failing to accomplish. They heard the constant roar, saw the geysers of earth erupting along the German line, and believed they were witnessing annihilation. Morale was high. Many of the PAL's battalions had never experienced combat, and they trusted the assurances of their officers. The artillery would do its work. The attack would be a walkover. By nightfall, they would be through the German lines and into open country beyond. Some men joked about racing each other to the German trenches. Others wrote confident letters home, promising to write again once the battle was won. The Germans knew better. From captured prisoners taken in trench raids, they had learned the precise date and hour of the coming attack. From intercepted telephone calls sent carelessly in codes that German intelligence had long since broken, they had confirmed every detail. They knew which units faced them, which objectives had been assigned, which routes the infantry would take across no man's land. The British had achieved no surprise whatsoever. The defenders had used the week of bombardment not to cower in terror, but to prepare. Machine gun belts were loaded. Grenades were stacked at the dugout entrances. Runners stood ready to carry word to the artillery batteries the moment the enemy appeared. The attack was set for 7:30 in the morning, an hour chosen to give the artillery observers clear light to direct their fire. There would be no cover of darkness, no pre-dawn mist to shroud the advancing infantry. The men would cross no man's land in broad daylight, visible to every German machine gunner and rifleman who survived the bombardment. The decision made military sense in terms of artillery coordination, but it surrendered yet another potential advantage to the defenders. On the morning of the 1st of July, the bombardment reached its crescendo. The guns fired faster than ever before, pouring a final storm of steel onto the German positions. At 7:20, an enormous explosion shattered the dawn. The mine beneath Hawthorne Redoubt had been detonated 10 minutes early, and British troops rushed forward to occupy the crater. The premature blast served as a final warning to the German defenders along the entire front. The infantry assault was minutes away. At 7:28, more mines erupted beneath German strongpoints, sending columns of earth and flame hundreds of feet into the air. The ground shook as though struck by an earthquake, and then, at 7:30 precisely, the bombardment lifted. The guns shifted their fire to the German second line, leaving the front trenches suddenly eerily quiet. Whistles blew along 25 miles of British trenches. Officers climbed the wooden ladders, waved their men forward, and stepped out into no man's land. Behind them came the infantry, clambering up from the trenches that had sheltered them, forming into lines, beginning their advance toward the German wire. In the German dugouts, the silence was the signal. Before the dust had settled, before the smoke had cleared, men were racing up the stairs with machine guns on their shoulders. They had rehearsed this moment countless times. 30 seconds to reach the surface, another 30 to set up the guns and begin firing. The British infantry were still 200 yards away when the first machine guns opened up. The morning of the 1st of July dawned clear and warm, a perfect summer day along the valley of the Somme. Skylarks sang above the trenches, oblivious to the carnage about to unfold beneath them. In the British lines, men who had barely slept checked their equipment one final time, tightened the straps on their packs, and waited for the whistles that would send them forward. Many had written letters home the night before, sealed them, and handed them to friends with quiet instructions. The bombardment still roared overhead, but its rhythm had changed, intensifying toward a crescendo that promised the moment was near. At 7 o'clock, the artillery fire reached its peak. Every gun along the front seemed to be firing at once, the individual reports merging into a continuous wall of sound that made speech impossible. The German trenches vanished beneath rolling clouds of smoke and debris. Watching from their positions, British soldiers allowed themselves to believe that nothing could survive such destruction. The week of bombardment had been merely preparation. This final hour was annihilation itself. 20 minutes later, the ground heaved. The mine beneath Hawthorne Redoubt erupted in a column of earth and flame that climbed hundreds of feet into the morning sky. The explosion was visible for miles, a man-made volcano that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Debris rained down for nearly a minute afterward. Chunks of chalk and shattered timber and things that had once been men. British troops from the waiting battalions rushed forward to occupy the lip of the vast crater, hoping to establish a position before the Germans could react. But the early detonation had given warning. All along the front, German soldiers who had been sheltering in their dugouts understood that the infantry assault was imminent. At 7:28, more mines detonated beneath German strongpoints. The earth shook with each explosion, and geysers of soil and smoke marked positions that had been strongholds moments before. Yasap, Lochnagar, Casino Point. Names that would become synonymous with the massive craters that replaced them. The Lochnagar mine alone contained 60,000 pounds of explosive, and its detonation created a hole in the earth 300 feet across and 70 feet deep. For a few seconds, silence seemed to fall across the battlefield as the echoes faded. Then the whistles blew. At 7:30 precisely, the artillery barrage lifted from the German front line and shifted to targets further back. In the sudden relative quiet, officers all along the 25-mile front climbed wooden ladders, stepped onto the parapet, and waved their men forward. The moment had come. Months of training, weeks of preparation, a week of bombardment. Everything had led to this instant when young men climbed out of the earth and walked toward the enemy. The experience of those first minutes varied enormously along the length of the front. It is an enduring myth that all British infantry climbed from their trenches at 7:30 and walked slowly toward the German line in neat formations, as though on parade. Some units did advance this way, following orders that assumed the bombardment had destroyed all resistance, but many commanders understood the danger of such tactics. They sent men out into no man's land before the bombardment lifted, crawling forward through shell holes and long grass, positioning themselves as close to the German wire as possible, so that the final dash would be measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. Yet whatever tactics were employed, the outcome in the northern sector was catastrophic. The German machine gunners had survived. Within seconds of the barrage lifting, they were racing up from their deep dugouts, hauling their weapons to the surface, setting up in shell holes and ruined trenches. They had trained for this moment, rehearsed it until the actions were automatic. By the time the British infantry had covered 50 yards, the first machine guns were already firing. The effect was devastating beyond anything the attackers had imagined. Men who had been walking upright moments before crumpled and fell, cut down by bullets they never saw coming. The machine guns fired in long traversing bursts, sweeping across the advancing lines like scythes through wheat. Where the wire remained intact, the infantry bunched together, seeking the few gaps that shellfire had torn in the belts. These gaps became killing grounds, funnels where machine gunners concentrated their fire with terrible efficiency. Men fell on top of men, piling up in tangled heaps of khaki and blood. Those who reached the wire and found no gap died on the barbs, hanging like scarecrows while bullets continued to strike them. Others threw themselves into shell holes, seeking any cover from the relentless fire, and found themselves pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. Small groups pressed forward with desperate courage, weaving between the dead and dying, only to be cut down in turn. The carefully rehearsed formations dissolved into chaos within minutes. Near Thiepval, the 36th Ulster Division achieved what seemed impossible. These were men from Belfast and the Protestant counties of the north, many of them members of the Orange Order, who had sworn to resist Irish Home Rule before the war intervened. They attacked with fierce determination, many wearing orange sashes over their uniforms in honor of the anniversary of the Battle of the Boyne. Racing forward even before the barrage lifted, they broke through the German front line and stormed into the Schwaben Redoubt, a massive fortification that anchored the German defenses. For a few hours, they held this prize against furious counterattacks. But the divisions on either flank had been stopped cold. The Ulsters found themselves isolated, a small island of success in a sea of failure. German troops still held the trenches on both sides of them. Ammunition ran low, casualties mounted, and no reinforcements could reach them across the fire-swept ground. As darkness fell, the survivors received orders to withdraw. They fell back across the same ground they had crossed that morning, leaving behind hundreds of their comrades who would never return. The Schwaben redoubt was German once more. On their right, the 32nd Division captured the Leipzig redoubt after savage fighting. Near La Boisselle, the 34th Division occupied the massive Lochnagar crater, its lips still smoking from the morning's detonation. These were toeholds, small dents in the German line purchased at enormous cost. They fell far short of the day's objectives, which had envisioned British troops advancing miles beyond the German front line. One of the greatest challenges facing commanders on both sides was the fog of war, the profound difficulty of understanding what was actually happening across the battlefield. The technology of communication had not kept pace with the technology of destruction. Reliable field radios did not yet exist. Telephone lines, carefully laid before the battle, were severed within minutes by shell fire. Officers trying to coordinate the attack were reduced to methods that would have been familiar to commanders a century before. Runners carried messages across ground swept by machine gun fire and artillery. Many never arrived, killed before they could deliver their dispatches. Flag signals were attempted, but smoke obscured the view, and few signalers survived long enough to complete their messages. Light signals blinked in the haze, often unseen or misunderstood. Even carrier pigeons were pressed into service, small birds bearing vital information in tiny capsules strapped to their legs. None of these methods could provide the rapid, reliable communication that modern warfare demanded. Artillery support operated according to rigid timetables established before the battle began. When the infantry started their attack, the guns shifted their fire to the German second line at a predetermined rate, creeping forward whether the infantry kept pace or not. The theory was sound. A creeping barrage just ahead of advancing troops would suppress enemy fire and create a moving wall of protection. But if the infantry were held up, if they encountered uncut wire or unexpected resistance, the barrage moved on without them. They lost the protection of their own artillery and faced enemy machine guns without support. This is precisely what happened across much of the front on that first morning. The infantry could not keep pace with the timetable. The barrage crept forward according to schedule, leaving the attacking troops exposed and vulnerable. German machine gunners, freed from the suppressing fire, emerged from cover and resumed their deadly work. The coordination that might have carried the infantry through the German defenses broke down, and the assault fragmented into isolated pockets of men fighting and dying without support. Aerial observation offered another potential solution. Balloons tethered behind the lines provided observers with commanding views of the battlefield, while aircraft flew reconnaissance missions to report on the progress of the attack. But smoke from the bombardment and from burning villages obscured the ground. The observers could see movement, could sometimes identify the flash of rifle fire, but could rarely determine which troops were British and which were German. Their reports were delayed and often contradictory. Commanders at headquarters, miles behind the front, waited hours for information that arrived too late to act upon. The result was paralysis at the highest levels. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, generals struggled to understand which attacks had succeeded and which had failed. Reinforcements were held back because no one knew where to send them. Opportunities were missed because the information needed to exploit them never arrived. The battle dissolved into hundreds of separate struggles, each fought in isolation, each invisible to the men trying to direct the overall effort. South of the Albert to Bapaume road, the story was different. Here, the British and French forces achieved successes that stood in stark contrast to the disasters further north. The 21st and 7th Divisions attacked the village of Mametz and took it despite fierce resistance. The fortified village of Fricourt, which had been expected to hold out for days, found itself outflanked when the divisions on either side pushed forward. Rather than sacrifice troops in a direct assault, the British simply bypassed the strong point. German defenders, realizing they would soon be surrounded, abandoned Fricourt during the night. Further south still, the 18th and 30th Divisions captured all their objectives, including the village of Montauban. This was the deepest British advance of the day, and it was secure by 11 o'clock in the morning. The success here offered a glimpse of what might have been possible across the entire front, a tantalizing suggestion that the German defenses were not impregnable after all. The reasons for success in the south were clear to those who studied the battle afterward. The Germans had not expected the offensive to extend so far in this direction and had concentrated their strongest defenses further north. More importantly, the artillery preparation in the southern sector had been reinforced by French heavy guns, whose crews were more experienced and whose shells were more reliable. These guns had done what the British bombardment further north had failed to accomplish. They had cut the wire. They had collapsed the dugouts. They had killed the defenders or driven them into shock before the infantry ever left their trenches. Alongside the British, the veteran French 20th Corps attacked with skill and determination, honed through 2 years of brutal warfare. They took all their first-day objectives and captured 2,500 German prisoners, men too dazed or too demoralized to continue fighting. The French had learned hard lessons at Verdun and in earlier battles, lessons about artillery coordination and infantry tactics that the British were only beginning to absorb. South of the River Somme itself, French colonial troops led their own attack at 9:30 in the morning. These soldiers, many from North and West Africa, advanced with precision and courage, seizing every objective assigned to them. By the end of the day, they had taken another 3,000 prisoners and established positions that would anchor the Allied line for months to come. Their success demonstrated what was possible when experienced troops, adequate artillery, and careful planning came together. But these victories in the south could not redeem the catastrophe in the north. As the sun set on the 1st of July, the true scale of the disaster began to emerge. Casualty clearing stations overflowed with wounded men, their numbers overwhelming the medical staff. Stretcher bearers worked through the night, carrying broken bodies back from no man's land, while German flares lit the darkness and occasional machine gun bursts reminded everyone that the enemy still held his ground. The final accounting was almost beyond comprehension. The British Army suffered 57,000 casualties on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. 19,000 of them were dead, killed outright or died of wounds before they could receive treatment. It remains the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army, a record that has never been approached before or since. German losses for the day were estimated at 12,000 men. The French, attacking with greater success, lost 7,000. The disproportion told its own story. The British had walked into prepared defenses, across ground the enemy knew intimately, against troops who had been warned of their coming. Courage could not overcome machine guns. Determination could not cut barbed wire. The old certainties of warfare had been swept away, replaced by the brutal arithmetic of industrial killing. And yet the battle was not over. It had barely begun. The 1st of July was only the opening day of an offensive that would continue for 4 more months, grinding forward through summer heat and autumn rain, consuming hundreds of thousands more lives before it finally sputtered to a halt in the November mud. The Somme had claimed its first harvest, but the fields of Picardy would drink much more blood before the guns at last fell silent. The guns fell silent in November, and the rains turned the battlefield to mud. After 4 months of fighting, the Allies had advanced 10 miles at a cost that defied comprehension. 430,000 British casualties, 200,000 French, 450,000 German, more than 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing along a single river valley in northern France. Today the Somme is quiet. Farmers plow fields that still yield rusted shells and fragments of bone. Cemeteries dot the landscape, their white headstones standing in rows like soldiers on eternal parade. The names carved there belong to men who were young once, who wrote letters home, who hoped to survive. They came from villages and cities across Britain and France and Germany, and they rest now in the soil they fought to hold. The Somme taught the world what modern war could cost. It remains a place of remembrance, where silence speaks louder than any words.